The palace burns in the dark, but the fire is not the strangest thing. Fires happen in ancient cities. Roof beams catch, storerooms smoulder, lamps overturn, armies arrive with torches in their hands. The strange thing is the silence that follows. In one place after another, across the eastern Mediterranean, the great centres of the Bronze Age do not simply suffer damage and recover. They go quiet. The scribes stop writing. The storerooms stop filling. The seals are no longer pressed into wet clay. The messengers no longer hurry between royal courts with tablets wrapped in cloth. The vast machinery of kingship, trade, taxation, ceremony, and war begins to vanish as if an entire way of organizing the world has forgotten how to remember itself. Somewhere in the ruins, a doorway collapses into ash. A wall painting flakes under heat. Clay tablets, meant only to be temporary records, are baked hard by the destruction that consumes the rooms around them. In that accident of fire, the voices of a dying world survive. They do not give a clean explanation. They do not say civilization ended because of one enemy, one drought, one earthquake, one betrayal, or one foolish king. What survives in the record suggests something more unsettling. A world so connected, so dependent on its own complexity, that when enough pressures arrived together, the system did not bend. It broke. The Bronze Age collapse is not the fall of one city. It is not the defeat of one empire. It is a chain of failures across a landscape of kingdoms that once believed themselves permanent. Mycenaean palaces in Greece are destroyed or abandoned. The Hittite Empire, which had ruled much of Anatolia and challenged Egypt itself, dissolves with shocking speed. Cities along the Levantine coast burn. Trade routes falter. Cyprus, rich in copper and central to the bronze economy, is shaken by destruction and disruption. In Egypt, the pharaohs survive. But even there the records speak of invasion, hunger, and strain. The old international order, built over centuries, enters a darkness from which it does not return in the same form. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because this is not only a story about ancient ruins, it is a story about how people live inside systems they barely see until those systems fail. To understand the night civilization forgot itself, it helps to picture the world before the darkness. The eastern Mediterranean of the late Bronze Age is not a primitive scatter of isolated tribes. It is a glittering, dangerous, deeply interconnected world. Great kings know one another by name. They exchange gifts, daughters, gold, horses, ivory, lapis lazuli, and carefully worded letters. Ships cross the sea carrying copper ingots shaped like stretched hides, jars of oil and wine, timber, textiles, weapons, luxury objects, and raw materials from distant places. Palace administrators count grain, livestock, workers, bronze tools, chariot parts, and offerings to the gods. Armies march with spears, shields, bows, and chariots. Scribes preserve the pulse of government in marks pressed into clay. This is a world of brightness and shadow. At the top stand kings who present themselves as chosen by gods, guardians of order, fathers of their lands. Around them cluster priests, officials, military commanders, craftsmen, merchants, and labourers. Beneath the grandeur are fields that must yield enough grain, herders who must maintain flocks, miners who must extract ore, sailors who must risk the sea, and workers who must obey palace demands. Bronze itself, the metal that gives the age its name, depends on connection. Copper is common enough in certain regions, but tin is rare, often travelling long distances through trade routes that are still debated. Without tin, copper cannot become the harder alloy needed for many weapons and tools. Without trade, bronze becomes a problem. That is one of the quiet vulnerabilities at the heart of this world. Its strength is also its weakness. The kingdoms of the late Bronze Age are not self-contained stones standing alone. They are more like parts of a living body, each organ depending on the others. Egypt has grain and gold. Cyprus has copper. Anatolia has timber, metals, and military power. The Levant has ports, merchants, and coastal cities linking inland kingdoms to the sea. Mycenaean Greece participates through palatial centres, warriors, craft production, and exchange. Mesopotamia lies farther east, but its diplomatic and cultural influence reaches into the same system of royal communication. The whole network is impressive, but it's also delicate. A failed harvest in one region can matter elsewhere. A blocked trade route can disturb distant workshops. A rebellion can weaken a border. A ship lost at sea is not just a local tragedy, it may mean missing metal. Unpaid obligations, unfinished weapons, and angry officials waiting in storerooms. For a long time, the system works well enough. It produces monuments, archives, weapons, temples, decorated pottery, international marriages, and the confidence of kings. Yet the evidence remains incomplete, and what remains often comes from palaces, not from the ordinary people who carried the weight of the system. We know far more about rulers than about the farmers who supplied them, the women grinding grain, the sailors watching clouds over the water, the enslaved workers, the refugees, the children born into cities that would not survive their lifetimes. The collapse is therefore not only a puzzle of states and armies, it is also a human disaster seen through broken windows. Imagine a coastal city near the end. The harbour is uneasy. Ships that should have arrived are late. Officials argue over grain. Messengers bring news from inland roads raids. Unrest. Perhaps rumours exaggerated by fear. The palace still stands. Its walls still bright in the sun, its storerooms still marked by seals and records. Priests still perform rituals, guards still watch the gates, but the rhythm is wrong. Too many things have to go right for the city to feel safe. And too many things are beginning to go wrong at once. Scholars still debate the exact sequence, because the collapse did not happen everywhere on a single night. The phrase Bronze Age collapse can make it sound like one sudden thunderclap, but the reality is more complex. Some places fell violently, some declined gradually, some were abandoned, some were rebuilt in altered form, some regions suffered deeply while others adapted. Egypt endured, though weakened. Assyria, further inland, survived and later expanded. Certain local communities continued after palaces disappeared. Civilization did not end everywhere. Humans did what humans always do. They fled, adapted, hid, fought, planted again, reused stones, told stories, and built new worlds from the wreckage of old ones. Still, something enormous was lost. In parts of Greece, the palace system collapses and writing disappears for centuries. In Anatolia, the Hittite imperial centre is abandoned, and the political map fragments, along the Syrian coast, archives stop. Diplomatic relationships that once linked kings across hundreds of miles fade into memory. The old language of international brotherhood, royal gifts, and palace order no longer holds the world together. It is as if the age had been written on clay, and then the hands that knew how to read it were scattered. One of the most haunting details is that some of the final records are not grand histories. They are urgent administrative messages. They speak of ships, troops, grain, danger, and requests for help. They're not written by people who believe they are living through a famous historical event. They are written by people trying to solve immediate problems. A king asks for assistance. A city reports enemy movement. An official worries about defense. The end of an age, when seen up close, looks less like a dramatic curtain falling and more like a series of unanswered messages. No single explanation fully accounts for this. Invasions alone are not enough. Drought alone is not enough. Earthquakes alone are not enough. Internal rebellion alone is not enough. Trade disruption alone is not enough. But together, these forces begin to look different. Climate stress may weaken harvests. Hunger may drive movement and conflict. Movement may destabilize borders. War may interrupt trade. Trade failure may cripple bronze production and palace economies. Palace failure may undermine political legitimacy. People who once served the system may decide the system no longer deserves their loyalty. Then the fire comes, and after the fire, silence. The mystery is not that ancient civilizations could fall. Every human system is mortal. The deeper mystery is how a world so sophisticated, so connected, and so confident could lose its shape so quickly. The Bronze Age did not vanish because people became less intelligent, less skilled, or less human. It vanished because the structure that held their lives together could no longer carry the weight placed upon it. And so the story begins in the ashes, with palaces after midnight, with clay tablets hardened by flames, with roads that no longer bring help, and with cities waiting for ships that may never return. Before the fires, before the broken gates and the abandoned archives, the Bronze Age world moves with an almost astonishing confidence. It is a world of roads and harbours, of scribes and seal stones, of kings who believe the gods have placed order in their hands and expect that order to continue. From the Nile Valley to the mountains of Anatolia, from the islands of the Aegean to the ports of the Levant, the great powers do not live in isolation. They watch one another, fear one another, flatter one another, marry into one another's families, and depend on one another more deeply than most of them would ever admit. The landscape itself helps create this connected world. The Eastern Mediterranean is not a closed plain where one empire can easily swallow all the others. It is a broken geography of seas, islands, mountain passes, river valleys, deserts, fertile coasts, and high plateaus. Egypt is protected by desert and fed by the Nile. Anatolia rises into rugged uplands where the Hittites build their power around fortified cities, chariot armies, and control of inland routes. The Levant, narrow and exposed, becomes a corridor between worlds, a coast of small but vital cities where goods, languages, gods, and rumours pass through constantly. Cyprus sits in the sea like a copper heart, across the Aegean. Mycenaean palaces command territories from hilltop citadels, looking outward toward trade and war. At the centre of this system stand the palaces. The word can make them sound like homes of luxury only, but in the late Bronze Age a palace is much more than a royal residence. It is a warehouse, a tax office, a ritual centre, a military headquarters, a workshop, a court, and a symbol of cosmic order. Grain comes in, wool comes in, olive oil, wine, livestock, timber, metal, and labour obligations are counted, stored, redistributed, or consumed. Craftsmen work under elite supervision. Scribes record transactions with a discipline that can feel almost modern in its precision, though the world they serve is profoundly different from ours. The palace does not merely sit above society. It organizes society around itself. In Mycenaean Greece, the palatial centers at places such as Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, and Thebes manage land, production, religious offerings, and military equipment through written records in Linear B. These records, preserved by the very fires that destroyed some of the palaces, reveal a tightly controlled world of allocations and inventories. They do not read like epic poetry. They read like administration, lists of wheels, armor, vessels, workers, animals, grain. And offerings survive where songs and memories vanished. It is one of the strange ironies of the collapse that the most ordinary documents became some of the most precious witnesses. In Egypt, power looks older and grander, wrapped in temples, royal ideology, and the long memory of pharaohs. Egypt is not untouched by crisis, but it has advantages many other states lack. The Nile gives it an agricultural foundation unlike the more rain-dependent lands to the north and east. Gold from Nubia strengthens royal wealth. Monumental temples project continuity. Yet even Egypt is part of the same diplomatic and economic world. Pharaohs exchange letters and gifts with other great kings. They campaign in the Levant. They rely on foreign materials, foreign soldiers, and foreign information. The image of Egyptian permanence is real in one sense, but it is also carefully maintained, like a statue polished against dust. The Hittite Empire is different again. Its capital, Hattusa, lies inland, fortified among rocky ridges and high plains. From there, Hittite kings rule a complicated empire of subject states, vassals, rivals, and uneasy frontiers. Their power depends not only on armies but on treaties, obligations, hostages, marriages, and the constant management of loyalty. Hatti can challenge Egypt at Kadesh and negotiate as an equal afterward. It can command fear across northern Syria and Anatolia. But the Hittite world is also exposed to internal dynastic struggles, regional pressures, and the difficulty of holding together a large empire across difficult terrain. Strength and strain live side by side. Then there are the coastal kingdoms, smaller in territory but immense in importance. Cities like Ugarit are not just dots on a map, they are hinges. Ugarit sits on the Syrian coast with access to inland routes, maritime trade, and the diplomatic world of the great powers. Its archives preserve letters in multiple languages and scripts, showing a society at the crossroads of cultures. A merchant or envoy passing through such a city might encounter goods from Egypt, Cyprus, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean. The city's prosperity depends on being connected. That is its gift, and eventually, perhaps, its danger. The Bronze Age economy is not capitalism in any modern sense, and it is not a simple free market of independent traders either. Palace control matters greatly, especially in the movement of prestige goods and strategic materials. Yet merchants also operate with remarkable reach. Ships carry cargoes that mix elite gifts, commercial goods, raw materials, and personal ventures. The famous shipwrecks of the period, especially those found off the coast of Anatolia, show how varied and international a single cargo could be: copper, tin, glass ingots, ivory, ebony, resin, pottery, jewellery, tools, weapons, and objects connected to several different regions. A ship at sea could become a floating map of the late Bronze Age world. Bronze itself gives the system its name, but also reveals its fragility. To make bronze, copper and tin must meet. Copper is abundant in Cyprus, among other places, but tin is much harder to source. Its roots remain debated, and the evidence is incomplete. but it likely travelled from far beyond the immediate centres of palace power through long and vulnerable networks. The people who used bronze swords, bronze spearheads, bronze tools, and bronze fittings may not have known every step in that chain. They did not need to. The system worked as long as the metal arrived. But any society that depends on distant materials also depends on the stability of places it cannot fully control. This interconnectedness creates a kind of Bronze Age globalization. The comparison must be used carefully, because their world is not ours, but the pattern is recognizable. Elites share symbols of status across borders. Diplomatic etiquette links royal courts. Specialized production depends on imported materials. Political decisions in one region affect conditions in another. A war in Anatolia can matter to a port in Syria. A shortage in Cyprus can affect workshops elsewhere. A breakdown in maritime security can turn prosperity into panic. The more the system grows, the more impressive it becomes, and the more points of failure it quietly accumulates. Daily life beneath this network is harder to see, but it is the foundation of everything. Fields must be ploughed, grain must be harvested and stored, sheep must be shorn, clay must be shaped, wood must be cut, ships must be repaired, roads must be guarded, walls must be maintained. The palace may command, but ordinary people carry the command into reality. A king can order bronze weapons, but miners, smelters, traders, sailors, porters, scribes, and smiths must make them possible. A king can boast of feeding his people, but rain, labour, soil, and storage decide whether the boast survives winter. The surprising detail is how much of this world depends on trust without calling it trust. Seals on jars, tablets in archives, treaties sworn before gods, royal marriages, diplomatic greetings, standardized weights, shared expectations of gift exchange, and the authority of scribes all help people act across distance. A merchant sends goods because he expects payment or protection. A vassal obeys because rebellion seems more dangerous than loyalty. A city opens its harbour because ships mean wealth. A farmer gives grain because the palace has power to demand it, and perhaps because the palace also offers security in return. Once enough, people stop believing those expectations will be honoured. The system begins to weaken even before the walls fall. For now, however, the world still shines. Bronze flashes in palace courtyards. Chariot wheels cut tracks into dry roads. Ships lean into the wind. Scribes press signs into damp clay. Kings send gifts and complaints across the sea. The machine is vast, intricate, and alive. Yet hidden inside its success is the question that will haunt everything that follows. How much pressure can such a world absorb before connection stops being strength and becomes the path by which collapse travels? The Bronze Age world is built on bronze, but bronze is never only metal. It is a promise that distant places will continue speaking to one another. It is copper hauled from mines, tin carried across uncertain routes, charcoal burned in furnaces, moulds prepared by craftsmen, and finished blades placed in the hands of warriors who may never think about the long chain of labour behind the weapon. A sword in a palace storeroom looks solid, simple, final. In truth, it is a network made visible. This is why the great cities of the late Bronze Age cannot be understood only by their walls or thrones. They have to be understood through the things that move between them: copper from Cyprus, tin from farther away, perhaps from Central Asia, Anatolia, or other routes scholars still debate. Grain from fertile river valleys and coastal plains, timber from mountain forests, horses bred and trained for elite warfare, ivory from distant animals turned into delicate luxury, glass ingots. Bright stones, oils, resins, textiles, carved boxes, ceremonial vessels, and raw materials that pass from hand to hand until their origins blur into royal possession. Every object carries geography inside it. The palace depends on this movement. Behind its thick walls, administrators transform the outside world into lists. A shipment arrives, and it becomes numbers. A field is harvested, and it becomes an allocation. A flock is counted, and it becomes wool for textiles, offerings for temples, rations for workers, wealth for elites. Scribes do not describe the beauty of the system. They measure it. They preserve its appetite. They record how many jars, how many wheels, how many workers, how many sheep, how much bronze, how much grain. Their tablets can seem dry until one remembers that every mark represents someone's labour, someone's obligation, someone's place inside the machinery. Bronze makes that machinery sharper. It strengthens agricultural tools, adorns elites, arms soldiers, equips chariots, and signals power. Yet its production is complicated enough to remind us that no palace is truly independent. Copper must be mined and smelted. Tin must arrive from somewhere else. The correct alloy must be made by skilled hands. The finished metal must be distributed according to need, status, and military urgency. In peaceful times, this seems manageable. In troubled times, it becomes a vulnerability. A palace can control land nearby, but it cannot easily control every mine, every caravan, every sea lane, every harbour, every political crisis in every region that supplies its workshops. Cyprus stands close to the heart of this story. The island is rich in copper, and its role in late Bronze Age exchange is difficult to overstate. The very name of copper may be linked to Cyprus, though linguistic histories are complicated and scholars still debate details. What matters for the ancient world is more concrete Cypriot copper moves widely. It travels in large ingots, often shaped like ox hides, a form convenient for carrying and perhaps meaningful in ways not fully understood. These ingots appear in shipwrecks and artistic scenes, heavy signs of an economy that turns the island's geology into international power. A cargo ship loaded with copper is not merely carrying metal, it is carrying future tools, weapons, debts, alliances, and expectations. One wreck off the coast of Anatolia, centuries later discovered beneath the sea, shows how astonishingly mixed such cargoes could be. Copper ingots, tin, glass, ivory, resin, ceramics, jewellery, weapons, and objects from multiple cultural spheres rested together on the seabed. The ship sank long before the final collapse, but it reveals the kind of world that made the collapse so consequential. This was not a collection of isolated villages trading casually across a beach. It was an international system in which specialized goods moved through complex channels, and where a single ship could carry the fingerprints of many lands. Grain is less glamorous than bronze, but in the end it may matter even more. A palace can survive without ivory. It cannot survive without food. Grain feeds workers, soldiers, priests, administrators, and dependent populations. It fills storerooms that give rulers practical power and symbolic legitimacy. A king who stores grain can survive a lean season, reward loyalty, sustain armies, and present himself as protector. A king whose granaries fail becomes vulnerable. Hunger is not only a biological crisis, it is a political force. It changes how people judge authority. It turns tax demands into insults. It makes migration sensible, rebellion imaginable, and loyalty expensive. Timber also carries hidden importance. The eastern Mediterranean world consumes wood for buildings, ships, tools, fires, and metalworking. Some regions have better access to forests than others. Cedar from Lebanon, timber from Anatolia, and other woods enter trade and royal projects. Ships require wood, and ships maintain trade. Charcoal fuels metallurgy, and metallurgy supports weapons and tools. A shortage in one material can echo through several parts of the system. What looks like a palace economy is, underneath, an environmental economy, constantly drawing on fields, forests, mines, rivers, and human bodies. There is a lesser-known kind of fragility in the specialized labor of this world. Palace systems often concentrate skilled production. Smiths, textile workers, chariot makers, perfumers, scribes, and other specialists may depend on palace support or supervision. This creates impressive quality and scale, but it also means that when palaces fail, knowledge does not disappear instantly. Yet the institutions that organize that knowledge can collapse. A craftsperson may still know how to work metal, but without imported tin, official orders, stored food, protected workshops, and stable markets, the old level of production becomes difficult to maintain. Skills survive in hands, but systems survive only when people, materials, and authority continue to meet. The chariot shows this perfectly. In the late Bronze Age, the chariot is a machine of prestige and war. It requires trained horses, skilled carpentry, leatherwork, bronze fittings, roads or suitable terrain, maintenance crews, and warriors trained to use it. It is not just a vehicle. It is an elite military ecosystem. A king who fields chariots demonstrates wealth, organization, and access to specialized resources. But such a system is expensive. It needs constant support when economies weaken, when horses are lost, when craftsmen scatter, when roads become unsafe. Chariot warfare becomes harder to sustain. This symbol of aristocratic power begins to reveal how demanding aristocratic power really is. The same is true of monumental building. Thick walls, gateways, temples, storerooms, and elite residences express strength, but they also consume labor. In times of confidence, a large construction project displays command over people and resources. In times of stress, the same demands may deepen resentment. Stone does not move itself. Mud brick does not shape itself. Every impressive wall is also a memory of forced or organized labor. The evidence remains incomplete, and it would be too simple to imagine every worker as unwilling. But the palace's power to mobilize bodies is one of its defining features. When that power is accepted, the walls rise. When it is questioned, the walls may become monuments to a bargain no longer believed. Across this world, prestige goods help hold elites together. Gold cups, carved ivories, fine textiles, decorated weapons, and exotic materials do more than please the eye. They communicate rank. They bind rulers through gift exchange. They create obligations between courts. A king sends a gift not simply because he is generous, but because generosity is a language of power. To refuse, delay, or reduce such gifts can signal weakness or insult. Luxury, in this sense, is political infrastructure. It is softer than a wall, but sometimes just as important. And so the Bronze Age machine runs on two kinds of necessity: the visible necessities of food, metal, wood, and labor, and the invisible necessities of trust, status, fear, and expectation. The palace must feed and command, the ports must receive, the ships must sail, the mines must produce, the scribes must count, the gods must be honored, the king must appear powerful. The system does not need perfection, but it does need enough continuity for people to believe tomorrow will resemble yesterday. That belief is the quiet foundation beneath the age. Long before the fires reach the palaces, long before desperate letters are pressed into clay, the essential question is already waiting inside every bronze blade and every sealed jar: what happens when the materials still exist, but the connections fail. Across the late Bronze Age world, kings write to one another as if they belong to a family. They call each other brothers. They speak of friendship, gifts, loyalty, marriages, insults, delays, and honor. The language is polished, formal, and often affectionate on the surface, but beneath it runs a colder truth. These royal letters are not casual messages between equals enjoying distant companionship. They are the nervous system of an international order, and every greeting, every gift, every complaint carries political weight. The most vivid window into this world comes from diplomatic archives, especially the letters found at Amarna in Egypt, where clay tablets preserve messages exchanged between Egypt and other powers during the 14th century BCE. These tablets are older than the final collapse, but they reveal the kind of system that later comes under strain. In them, rulers from Babylon, Mitanni, Assyria, Hatti, Cyprus, and smaller Levantine states communicate with the Egyptian court. Some write with confidence, others plead, some complain that the pharaoh has sent too little gold, others beg for troops against local enemies. Great kings address one another as brothers, while lesser rulers use the language of servants, dust, and submission. The words show a world carefully arranged by rank. Gold is everywhere in these letters, not always physically, but emotionally. Egypt has gold, and other kings know it. They expect gifts worthy of their status. When a shipment seems inadequate, the polite mask slips. A ruler may insist that friendship requires generosity, that a brother should not be treated cheaply, that a royal marriage deserves proper wealth. These complaints can sound almost petty until one understands what is at stake. In this world, gifts are not decorations. They are proof that relationships remain alive. A poor gift suggests disrespect. A delayed gift suggests weakness. A broken exchange suggests that the web of obligation is fraying. Royal marriages strengthen the same web. Daughters move between courts as living treaties, carrying prestige, risk, and expectation. A princess sent abroad is not merely a bride. She is a diplomatic bridge, a sign that two houses recognize each other's importance, yet the exchange is rarely equal. Egypt, especially, often receives foreign princesses but does not normally send Egyptian royal daughters to foreign kings. That imbalance tells its own story, even among brothers. Hierarchy persists. The language of equality can soften rivalry, but it does not erase it. The great powers of the age understand one another through ceremony as much as through force. A treaty sworn before gods is not a minor document. It binds rulers in a sacred and political order. To break it is not only to betray a king, but to offend divine witnesses. The famous peace between Egypt and Hatti after the Battle of Kadesh shows how warfare and diplomacy interlock. Two great states fight, boast, negotiate, and eventually formalize peace. The result is not modern peace in any simple sense, but a managed balance, supported by oaths, marriages, and mutual recognition. The world survives not because kings trust each other completely, but because they understand the cost of uncontrolled conflict. Still, the letters also reveal weakness at the edges. Smaller rulers in Canaan write anxiously to Egypt, asking for archers, protection, and recognition. They accuse rivals of treachery. They claim loyalty while warning that cities may be lost. They describe local warfare, shifting alliances, and the difficulty of maintaining order. Scholars still debate how much of this language is exaggerated for political effect, because desperate language could be a tool for extracting Egyptian help. But even if some reports are inflated, they show a landscape where local rulers depend on distant imperial attention. If the great king is slow to respond, a small city may find itself alone. This is one of the hidden contradictions of the late Bronze Age order. The system is international, but it is not evenly strong. At the top, great kings exchange gifts and titles. Below them, vassals, governors, mayors, merchants, and military officers struggle with the daily reality of defense, taxation, rivalry, and survival. A message can travel across hundreds of miles, but a message is not an army. A treaty can declare loyalty, but a treaty does not fill a granary. The world of royal brothers depends on countless local acts of obedience that the letters only partly reveal. The scribes who write these tablets are themselves essential figures. They know the diplomatic language, often Akkadian, which serves as a shared medium among courts, even when it is not the native tongue of the rulers involved. They know formulas of respect. They know how to shape a complaint without making it an open insult. They know how to preserve rank in grammar. Their work allows kings to appear present across distance. Without scribes, the international world becomes slower, narrower, more dependent on memory and spoken messengers. Writing does not create the system by itself, but it gives the system reach. There is something almost fragile in the image of this order. Clay tablets crossing deserts and seas, carrying the egos of kings. Clay is humble, but the messages it carries can decide marriages, alliances, military support, and trade. A tablet may be wrapped, sealed, transported by a messenger, presented at court, read aloud, answered, stored, and forgotten until fire or accident preserves it for modern eyes. The entire performance depends on roads being passable, ships being safe, courts being functional, and rulers caring enough to respond. Diplomacy, like bronze, requires a chain. The letters also show how information moves unevenly. A king may know that a neighbouring ruler is dead before a distant court hears of it. A vassal may describe an enemy as a rebel, while that enemy describes himself as loyal. Reports arrive late, filtered by fear and self-interest. No ruler sees the whole board clearly. Even powerful kings live inside partial knowledge. They command armies and treasuries, but they also depend on messengers who may be delayed, bribed, killed, or ignored. The Bronze Age international system is sophisticated, but it is not omniscient. This matters because collapse often begins as confusion before it becomes catastrophe. A delayed shipment may be blamed on weather, not piracy. A failed harvest may seem local, not regional. A border raid may look like one more manageable disturbance. A plea from a vassal may sound exaggerated until the city is gone. The evidence remains incomplete, but the surviving messages suggest a world where warning signs could be visible without being fully understood. The rulers are not blind. They are trapped by distance, pride, habit, and the assumption that the system that worked yesterday will work tomorrow. In the courts, the ceremonies continue, gifts are displayed, messengers bow, scribes prepare replies, kings speak of brotherhood, friendship, and eternal loyalty. The words are elegant, and sometimes they are sincere in the limited way politics allows. Yet beneath the language of family lies dependency. Egypt needs stable neighbours. Hatti needs loyal vassals. Coastal cities need open seas. Cyprus needs exchange partners. Mycenaean elites need materials and prestige. Smaller rulers need protection. Everyone needs someone else to keep the world in motion. That is the deeper meaning of the royal letters. They do not simply show ancient diplomacy at its height. They show a civilization talking to itself across distance, reassuring itself that order still exists because the proper words are still being written. Brother to brother, king to king, servant to lord, the tablets carry confidence, anxiety, greed, flattery, and fear. They are the voice of a world that has learned how to communicate brilliantly, but not how to survive every pressure that communication reveals. And when the first cracks begin to widen, the language of brotherhood will not be enough. A king can ask why his gold has not arrived. A vassal can beg for archers. A ruler can swear loyalty by the gods. But clay cannot stop famine, and courtesy cannot hold a gate against fire. The first cracks do not appear as a single thunderclap. They appear as unease. A shipment is delayed, then another. A border town sends a sharper message than usual. A ruler complains that grain is short. A coastal city worries about ships it cannot see. A palace strengthens its defences, perhaps from confidence, perhaps from fear. The old world is still standing, and from a distance it may even look stable. But the rhythm has changed. The machinery continues to move, only now it grinds. In the last centuries of the Bronze Age, signs of stress begin to gather across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Not everywhere at once, and not in one simple pattern, but widely enough that later historians cannot ignore the accumulation. The evidence remains incomplete, because ancient crises do not leave tidy explanations for modern readers. A burned layer may show destruction, but not always who caused it. A deserted settlement may suggest insecurity, famine, migration, or political change. A text may describe enemies, but not whether the writer exaggerates. Still, when archaeology, climate evidence, and written records are placed beside one another, the picture grows darker. One pressure comes from food. The great palace systems depend on harvests, storage, and redistribution. They can endure a bad year if granaries are full and administration is strong. They can perhaps endure several hardships if trade and authority remain intact. But repeated shortages are different. Hunger weakens obedience. It makes workers harder to control and soldiers harder to feed. It pushes families to move, sometimes quietly, sometimes desperately. It turns the palace from protector into collector, from guardian into burden. No king can command rain, though many claim the favour of gods who should have provided it. Evidence from parts of the eastern Mediterranean suggests episodes of aridity around the period of collapse. Though scholars still debate the timing, severity, and regional differences, climate stress is not a magic key that opens every locked door. Some areas suffer more than others, some adapt, some already live with uncertainty. But drought does not need to destroy every field to matter. It only needs to reduce yields enough, in enough places, while other pressures are rising. A palace economy built on extraction and redistribution can become brittle when the surplus shrinks. The king still needs grain for troops, rituals, workers, and allies. The people still need grain to live. Between those needs, politics begins to burn before the city does. Trade also shows signs of strain. The late Bronze Age world depends on long-distance movement, especially for metal. Copper and tin must reach workshops. Ships must cross safely. Merchants and envoys must trust that ports remain open. But unsettled seas, hostile coasts, raids, storms, and political disorder can interrupt the flow. A single missing cargo does not end an age. Many missing cargoes, across years of uncertainty, begin to change what is possible. The palace can promise weapons, tools, and gifts, but without metal those promises become thinner. Prestige suffers, military readiness suffers, the ability to reward loyalty suffers. There are also signs of defensive anxiety. Some settlements appear to strengthen walls or shift toward more defensible locations. In parts of Greece, the great citadels seem increasingly concerned with protection, water access, and fortification. At Mycenae and Tyrins, impressive engineering works secure access to water sources, a practical detail that becomes more meaningful if siege or insecurity is feared. These projects do not prove that collapse is already inevitable, but they suggest that elites are thinking about danger in physical terms. A palace that invests in hidden or protected water supply understands that walls alone are not enough. A city under siege dies by thirst as surely as by spear. The surprising detail is how ordinary some of the warnings look. Collapse is often imagined as a dramatic invasion fleet on the horizon, but many of the early signs are administrative, agricultural, and logistical. Officials worrying about allocations, communities changing settlement patterns, rulers asking for grain, fortifications repaired, diplomatic messages growing more urgent. The first cracks are not always spectacular. Sometimes they are the absence of expected order. No cargo, no reply. No rain, no surplus, no help. Internal tension likely grows as well. Palace systems create hierarchy, and hierarchy can survive for centuries when it delivers security, food, identity, and divine legitimacy. But when stress rises, obligations that once seemed normal may become intolerable. Farmers may resist demands, workers may flee, local elites may challenge central authority, mercenaries or displaced groups may turn against former patrons. The written evidence rarely allows ordinary anger to speak directly. Yet what survives in the record suggests that social pressure cannot be separated from political collapse. A palace is not destroyed only when enemies enter from outside. It can also weaken when people inside its world no longer believe it deserves their labour. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire faces its own burdens. It is large, powerful, and prestigious. But maintaining such an empire requires constant effort. Vassal states must be managed, rivals must be checked, grain must move, dynastic legitimacy must be defended. Western Anatolia remains complicated and sometimes unstable. Northern groups such as the Kaska had long troubled Hittite frontiers. No single enemy explains the empire's end, but a state already managing many fronts can suffer badly when new problems arrive together. Imperial strength often looks overwhelming until the cost of maintaining it outruns the centre's ability to respond. Along the Levantine coast, cities prosper precisely because they connect the inland and maritime worlds. That makes them wealthy, cosmopolitan, and vulnerable. Ports depend on predictable movement. If the sea becomes dangerous, if inland routes are threatened, if great kings cannot protect their vassals, coastal prosperity can turn fragile quickly. Ugarit, which will later leave some of the most haunting final messages of the age, belongs to this world of opportunity and exposure. Its archives show a city deeply tied into international networks. Such a city can thrive when the network thrives. When the network shakes, it feels the tremor early. Egypt, too, sees trouble. Though it survives the broader collapse, its records from the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE speak of foreign groups, migration, warfare, and pressure on borders. Egyptian inscriptions present the pharaoh as victorious, as Egyptian royal inscriptions usually do. They're not neutral reports, they are monuments of power. Yet even propaganda can reveal anxiety by the problems it chooses to display. When texts emphasize enemies on land and sea, when they describe groups moving with families and possessions, when victory has to be carved so loudly into stone, it suggests that the state is facing something more complicated than a routine raid. Scholars still debate the relationship between these pressures. Did drought drive migration, which drove warfare? Did trade disruption weaken palaces, which made them vulnerable to rebellion? Did earthquakes damage cities already under economic strain? Did new forms of warfare make old chariot elites less dominant? Did piracy and raiding grow because central powers could no longer police movement? The answer may be yes in several directions at once. Historical crises rarely obey a single line of cause and effect. They are more like storms formed from colliding winds. The people living through these years do not know they are entering a named collapse. They experience it as bad seasons, rumours, taxes, conscription, missing ships, strange groups on the move, officials demanding more, walls being repaired, roads feeling less safe, and prayers that seem to return unanswered. For some, the crisis may look temporary. The palace has survived before. The king has enemies, but kings always have enemies. A harvest can fail and then recover. A city can burn and be rebuilt. The old world teaches its people to expect continuity because continuity has been its greatest achievement. That expectation may be one of the most dangerous things a civilization possesses, not because confidence is foolish, but because it delays recognition. A system that has overcome many smaller shocks may assume it can overcome the next one, even when the next one is not one shock at all. It is several, arriving close together, feeding one another, hiding inside ordinary problems until the combined weight becomes impossible to carry. So the cracks widen, not everywhere in the same way, not on the same day, not with the clarity later storytellers might desire. In the fields, the margin narrows. At sea, the routes feel less certain. In the courts, the language of brotherhood becomes thinner. At the walls, engineers think about water and siege. In the archives, messages grow sharper. The Bronze Age world is still alive, but it has begun to hear the sound of its own joints under pressure. The fires do not arrive in a neat line across the map. They leap, vanish, return, and leave behind layers of ash that modern archaeologists must read with caution. One city burns while another survives a little longer. One palace is violently destroyed. Another is abandoned. Another continues in reduced form, and another is rebuilt by people whose names are lost. The Bronze Age collapse is not a single army marching from west to east or north to south. It is a spreading failure, visible in destruction levels, deserted centres, disrupted trade, broken administrative systems, and the sudden disappearance of habits that had once seemed permanent. In Mycenaean Greece, the signs are especially dramatic because the palace world leaves such a sharp before and after image. For centuries, Mycenaean elites had occupied fortified centres, managed territories, used Linear B writing for administration, built tholos tombs and citadels, and participated in wider Mediterranean exchange. Their palaces were not identical to those of Egypt or Hatti, but they belonged to the same broad world of elite display, controlled production, and international contact. Then, around the end of the 13th century and into the 12th century BCE, many of these centres suffer destruction or decline. Pylos is burned. Mycenae and Tiryns are damaged. Thebes and other sites show disruption. The old administrative order does not simply repair itself. The burning of Pylos is one of the clearest windows into the disaster. Its palace archive was not meant to last. The clay tablets were temporary records, probably intended to be recycled after their usefulness passed. But the fire that destroyed the palace baked them hard, preserving lists of rowers, military preparations, religious offerings, land, livestock, and commodities. Some tablets seem to show a state concerned with coastal defence, though scholars still debate exactly how to interpret them. The detail is haunting because the records do not describe the final attack in grand language. They preserve the nervous paperwork of a palace trying to organize itself under pressure. Then the writing stops. At Mycenae, the great citadel with its massive walls and famous gate does not vanish in one simple moment, but it is shaken. Destruction, rebuilding, and continued occupation complicate the picture. This matters because collapse is often imagined as total emptiness. In reality, people remain in many places. They repair, salvage, adapt, and live among ruins. But the palace system as a centralized administrative structure fades. Linear B writing disappears from Greece for centuries. That loss is not merely technical. It means the institutions that needed that writing no longer function. Scribes do not keep writing for a world that no longer employs them. Across the Aegean, settlement patterns change. Some sites shrink. Some communities move to more defensible locations. Pottery styles shift. Burial customs alter. Population may decline in certain regions, though measuring ancient population is difficult and the evidence remains incomplete. The world of great palatial centres gives way to smaller, more localized societies. Later Greeks would remember a heroic age of powerful kings and warlike ancestors, but memory transforms. It preserves flashes of bronze armour, feasting halls, sea journeys, and destroyed cities, while blurring the administrative reality that archaeology reveals. The later stories are not simple records of the collapse, but they may carry distant echoes of a world that had truly fallen. In Anatolia, the destruction and abandonment are even more politically startling. The Hittite Empire had been one of the great powers of the age. Its rulers negotiated with Egypt, commanded vassals, fought major wars, and built their capital at Hattusa into a formidable imperial centre. Yet by the early 12th century BCE, the empire as a unified force is gone. Hattusa is abandoned and partly burned, though the exact circumstances are debated. Some evidence suggests that parts of the city may have been emptied before the final destruction, which makes the end more mysterious rather than less. A city can be conquered in a day, but an imperial capital being evacuated before burning hints at deeper breakdown. The Hittite archives stop. Royal authority fragments. Former vassal regions and related successor states continue in different forms, especially in northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, where Neo-Hittite kingdoms preserve elements of Hittite culture and political tradition. This is important. The Hittites do not disappear as people. Their imperial system collapses. Their language, symbols, and practices survive in altered landscapes. Collapse rarely means that everyone dies. More often it means that the structures connecting people to power, writing, taxation, army, and identity are torn apart and rewoven differently. Along the Syrian coast, cities face their own catastrophe. Ugarit, rich, literate, and deeply connected, is destroyed and not rebuilt as the same urban kingdom. Its fall will later become one of the most poignant pieces of the entire puzzle because of the tablets found in its ruins. But Ugarit is only one part of a wider coastal disruption. Ports that once connected Egypt, Cyprus, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean suddenly become vulnerable. A harbour is an opening to wealth in stable times and an opening to danger in unstable times. The sea that once carried copper, wine, oil, and royal gifts can also carry raiders, refugees, and news of cities already burning. Cyprus experiences disruption as well, though again the picture is not a simple island-wide ending. Some sites are destroyed, others continue or transform. New cultural influences appear. The island's copper remains valuable, but value alone does not guarantee stability. In fact, it may attract violence. The settlements of Cyprus sit at the centre of maritime exchange, and during a period of insecurity, centrality can become exposure. The same routes that made the island wealthy can bring fire to its coasts. In the Levant, destruction levels appear at a number of sites, but the pattern varies. Some cities fall, others change hands, and new groups emerge in the aftermath. The region's position as a bridge between Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, Arabia, and the Mediterranean means it absorbs shocks from several directions. Egyptian power in Canaan weakens over time. Local polities shift. The archaeological record shows both destruction and continuity, both rupture and adaptation. It refuses to give the satisfaction of a single sweeping answer. This is where the popular image of the collapse can mislead. It is tempting to imagine a single wave of invaders burning every city in their path. Egyptian records about enemies from the sea helped create that picture, and later storytelling made it even more dramatic. But archaeology is more complicated. Some destructions may be caused by warfare, others may involve internal conflict, earthquake damage, abandonment, accidental fire, or combinations of causes. A burned palace does not name its destroyer. A fallen wall does not explain whether it was broken by enemy hands, shaking earth, or later reuse. The record must be read patiently, and even then scholars still debate much of it. What can be said is that the palace-centered world suffers a profound and widespread rupture. The rhythm of administration breaks, elite consumption changes, international trade contracts or reorganizes. Some writing systems vanish in particular regions. Cities that had stood as nodes in a vast diplomatic and economic network lose their place. The collapse is visible not only in destruction, but in what fails to return afterward. A city can burn and recover. A civilization collapses when the institutions that once made recovery possible no longer function. In that sense, the fires are both cause and symptom. They destroy buildings, kill people, and shatter archives, but they also reveal that the system around those buildings has already weakened. A palace with loyal troops, stored grain, secure supply lines, functioning diplomacy, and public legitimacy has a chance to rebuild. A palace surrounded by hunger, broken trade, restless subjects, hostile migrants, empty treasuries, and unreliable allies may burn once and never rise again. The flame is visible, the prior weakening is harder to see. By the end of this wave of destruction and disruption, the Eastern Mediterranean is no longer the world of royal brothers and confident palaces. Greece loses its palace administrations, Hatti loses its empire, Ugarit loses its kingdom, Egyptian influence contracts, coastal trade changes, new peoples and new political forms begin to appear in the spaces left behind. The old Bronze Age map becomes unreadable, not because the land itself has changed, but because the meanings written across it have been erased. And yet, in the ash, something survives. Clay tablets harden, broken walls remain, pottery fragments scatter through burned rooms, charred seeds preserve traces of last meals and stored harvests. Human bones, weapons, tools, collapsed beams, and abandoned courtyards become evidence for a future no one in the burning cities could imagine. The fire reaches the palaces, but it also freezes moments of fear, preparation, violence, and loss. The night civilization forgot itself is not silent after all. It speaks in ruins, and its voice is damaged, partial, and unforgettable. The disappearance of the Hittite Empire is one of the most unsettling parts of the Bronze Age collapse because it does not feel like the fall of a minor kingdom at the edge of history. Hatti had been a great power, a state whose kings stood among the highest rulers of the age. Its armies had marched into Syria. Its diplomats had negotiated with Egypt. Its scribes had preserved treaties, rituals, myths, laws, and royal commands in archives at Hattusa. Its rulers had governed a difficult empire of subject lands, frontier peoples, vassal kings, and rival powers. Then, within the storm of the early 12th century BCE, the imperial voice falls quiet. Hattusa itself is a city made for authority, set in the rugged highlands of central Anatolia, surrounded by steep slopes and stone defences. It looks less like a soft palace city than a mountain stronghold of kings who understood danger. Its walls are massive. Its gates are guarded by sculpted lions, sphinxes, and warriors. Its temples show the religious weight of the capital. Its archives show the administrative and ritual mind of the empire. The city does not sit beside an easy sea route or a gentle river plain. It commands from the interior, drawing strength from land, roads, vassals, storehouses, and the ability to project power across difficult terrain. That makes its end feel even more strange. Hattusa is not simply overwhelmed in a clear, well-recorded conquest. The evidence suggests abandonment, burning, and fragmentation, but not in a way that allows a single simple story. Some parts of the capital may have been cleared before the final destruction. Valuable items appear to have been removed from certain buildings. The royal administration may already have withdrawn or collapsed before fire consumed parts of the city. Scholars still debate the sequence, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the possibility of an organized evacuation or gradual desertion makes the fall of Hattusa feel less like one dramatic assault and more like the last stage of an imperial failure already underway. The Hittite Empire had always required constant management. Its geography was both a shield and a burden. Central Anatolia could protect the core from some threats, but the empire extended across zones of very different peoples, landscapes, and political loyalties. To the north, the Casca had long troubled Hittite territory, raiding and pressuring the kingdom across generations. To the west lay complex and often unstable regions whose relationship to Hittite power was never fully settled. To the southeast, Syria was rich and strategic, but also contested. Holding these areas together required military force, diplomacy, treaties, dynastic legitimacy, and a steady flow of resources. An empire is not a monument. It is a task that must be performed every day. By the late 13th century BCE, that task seems to have become harder. Hittite kings faced internal dynastic tensions, conflicts with neighbouring powers, and the constant challenge of keeping vassals loyal. The empire had known greatness under rulers such as Suppiluliuma I, and later maintained high status in the international order. But greatness does not remove vulnerability. It can increase it. A great empire has more frontiers to defend, more elites to satisfy, more subject rulers to watch, more grain to collect, more roads to secure, and more enemies waiting for weakness. When conditions are stable, size looks like strength. When pressure rises, size can become exposure. Food may have been one of the pressures. Hittite texts from earlier periods show concern with famine and grain supply, and later traditions of crisis suggest that Anatolia was not immune to shortage. Some records indicate that grain had to be imported into Hittite territory at times, including from Egypt. This does not prove that famine alone destroyed the empire, but it reminds us that even powerful inland states could depend on external supply during difficult moments. If drought, poor harvests, disrupted routes, and political instability converged, the imperial centre would have faced a dangerous question. How does a king command loyalty when he cannot guarantee food? The Hittite state also depended on written authority. Treaties with vassals were carefully preserved. Oaths bound subordinate rulers to the king. Rituals maintained divine favour. Archives recorded obligations and precedents. The empire imagined itself as a world of order enforced through words, gods, and armies. But documents are powerful only while institutions remain capable of acting on them. A treaty tablet cannot keep a vassal loyal if the king's army cannot arrive. An oath cannot feed a province. A ritual cannot repair a broken supply chain. When central force weakens, the sacred and legal language of empire becomes increasingly fragile. There is a striking human dimension to this. In the final years, one can imagine officials in Hattusa still performing the habits of empire. Scribes prepare tablets, priests maintain ceremonies, messengers arrive from troubled regions, storehouses are checked, orders are sent. Perhaps the capital still looks imposing from its gates, still able to intimidate visitors with stone and ritual. Yet beyond the walls, the map may already be slipping away. A vassal delays tribute, a road becomes unsafe. A frontier report goes unanswered, a harvest disappoints, a rival senses weakness. None of these alone ends an empire. Together, they make the centre feel farther away. When Hattusa is abandoned, the silence is not total. This is one of the most important details. Hittite culture does not vanish from the earth. In northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, successor kingdoms later preserve elements of Hittite and Luwian tradition. Monumental inscriptions, royal names, artistic styles, and political memories continue in altered form. These Neo-Hittite states are not the old empire resurrected, but they show that people, languages, and symbols survived the imperial collapse. The fall of Hatti is therefore not an extinction, it is a shattering. The central vessel breaks, and fragments remain, sharp and recognizable, scattered across a changed world. This distinction matters because collapse often deceives the imagination. A vanished empire can sound like a vanished people, but the end of the Hittite Empire means the end of the political structure, a capital-centered system, and an international role. Farmers still farmed where they could, local rulers still competed, craftsmen still worked, families still remembered gods, places, and customs. Some communities may have barely understood the full scale of what had happened at first, for them. The empire might have been taxes, soldiers, roads, commands, and distant royal names. When it failed, life did not become empty. It became more local, more dangerous, and less predictable. The mystery of the Hittite silence is sharpened by comparison with Egypt. Egypt also faced pressure, invasion, internal strain, and economic difficulty. Yet it survived as a state, weakened but continuous. Hatti did not. Why one endured and the other fractured remains debated. Egypt had the Nile, a stronger geographic core, deeper traditions of centralized continuity, and perhaps better defensive advantages against some threats. Hatti's mountainous imperial structure and dependence on managing many unstable regions may have made it more vulnerable to cascading failure. No single explanation fully accounts for the difference, but the contrast shows that collapse is never only about the severity of crisis. It is also about the shape of the society facing it. By the time the Hittite imperial capital falls quiet, the late Bronze Age world has lost one of its pillars. The diplomatic balance changes. Northern Syria is transformed. Former vassals and neighbours adjust to the absence of the old power. The royal brotherhood of great kings is broken beyond repair. A court that once answered Egypt and commanded subject rulers now leaves behind archives for strangers to uncover thousands of years later. The empire's last great act is not a declaration, not a victory inscription, not a final heroic defense preserved by its own scribes. It is absence. That absence is why Hatti haunts the collapse. In the ruins of Hattusa, one feels not only destruction, but withdrawal, as if authority itself has receded from the stones. The gates remain, the walls remain, the high ridges remain, but the system that gave them meaning is gone. Wind moves through places where messengers once climbed toward royal buildings. The tablets lie buried. The imperial roads no longer lead to a centre that can answer. A great power has not merely been defeated. It has stopped being able to hold itself together, and in that silence the Bronze Age loses one of the voices that once told the world it was still in order. At Ugarit, the end comes close enough to touch. The ruins do not simply show another destroyed city on a troubled coast. They preserve the fear of a kingdom that still has a government, still has scribes, still has obligations, still believes messages can move through the world and bring help before it is too late. Ugarit is not silent in its final hours. It speaks, and the voice that survives is not the voice of myth. It is the voice of administration under threat, of kings and officials trying to understand how danger has reached their gates while the old protections fail around them. The city stands on the Syrian coast, near the sea but tied to inland routes, a place made wealthy by connection. Its position gives it access to maritime trade, diplomatic exchange, and the movement of goods between the Mediterranean and the great lands beyond. Ugarit is small compared with Egypt or Hatti, but it is not insignificant. It is a cosmopolitan city with archives in several languages and scripts, a kingdom that sits between larger powers and survives through skillful diplomacy, trade, and service to the wider system. In its streets and storerooms, the Bronze Age world gathers in miniature. The archives of Ugarit are extraordinary because they reveal more than royal display. They reveal a working society. There are letters, legal documents, economic records, religious texts, treaties, school exercises, and myths. Scribes write in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age, and in Ugaritic, a local alphabetic cuneiform script that shows remarkable intellectual creativity. That detail is easy to pass over, but it is one of Ugarit's most surprising gifts to history. Here is a city not merely receiving culture from greater powers, but shaping its own written world. Its alphabetic script stands at a crossroads in the long history of writing, even as the kingdom itself approaches disaster. Ugarit's prosperity depends on balance. It must honour its overlords and maintain relations with powerful neighbours. It must keep trade flowing. It must manage merchants, ships, fields, soldiers, temples, and palace demands. It must look inland and seaward at the same time. In calmer centuries, that position brings wealth. During collapse, it becomes perilous. A city open to many routes is also open to many shocks. If Anatolia weakens, Ugarit feels it. If the sea becomes dangerous, Ugarit feels it. If Egypt cannot project power as before, Ugarit feels it. If displaced groups move along coastlines, Ugarit is exposed. The famous final letters from Ugarit are haunting because they do not explain the whole collapse, but they reveal the atmosphere of it. One message, often discussed by scholars, speaks of enemy ships and danger while the city's own ships and troops are absent. The exact interpretation of the tablets is debated, and their sequence is not always certain. But what survives in the record suggests a kingdom caught at the worst possible moment. Its defences are strained. Its allies are distant or unable to respond. Its military resources may not be where they are needed. The city still sends and receives words, but words are losing their power to change events. There is a terrible ordinariness in that. Ugarit's end is not preserved as a heroic final stand. It is preserved through communications that feel unfinished. A king reports danger. Another ruler sends warning or reassurance. Officials try to coordinate. The city appears to be aware of threat before destruction arrives. Yet awareness is not the same as rescue. Many disasters are like this. People see the edge before they fall over it. They understand enough to fear, but not enough to escape. The destruction of Ugarit was severe. The city was burned and abandoned, and unlike some other places, it did not recover as the same royal centre. Its archives were baked in the fire, preserving the tablets that now allow modern readers to stand almost inside the crisis. The fire that ended the palace also protected its memory. Without that destruction, many tablets might have dissolved back into earth. The catastrophe became the archivist. That is one of the grim ironies of ancient history. We often hear the past most clearly where it suffered most violently. Yet even here, certainty is limited. Scholars still debate who destroyed Ugarit. The attackers may have been connected to the wider movements often grouped under the label Sea Peoples, but that term itself is complicated and drawn largely from Egyptian sources. Other forces may have been involved: regional enemies, displaced groups, pirates, opportunistic raiders, or a combination created by the breakdown of larger powers. The tablets show fear and danger, but they do not hand us a complete enemy list. Archaeology gives the burn layer, texts give alarm, the rest must be reconstructed carefully. Ugarit also shows how the collapse travels through dependency. A great imperial capital may fall because its frontiers fail and its resources thin. A coastal kingdom may fall because the powers it depends on cannot protect it, because trade routes become unsafe, because its ships are away, because enemies know the moment is favourable, because the old web has torn. The city's destruction is local, but the conditions that make it possible are regional. Ugarit is not merely unlucky. It is caught in a failing world. Picture the harbour before the end. Not in fantasy, not with impossible clarity, but through what the evidence allows. There are ships that should represent wealth and safety. There are warehouses where goods from different lands pass under seal. There are scribes trained to transform events into tablets, still trusting that a written warning can matter. There are families who know the routines of a port city loading, bargaining, carrying, waiting for sales. Somewhere, perhaps, news arrives that other cities have suffered. Somewhere, officials understand that the kingdom's forces are not ready. The sea that once promised connection begins to look like an opening through which ruin can enter. The human scale of Ugarit matters because the Bronze Age collapse can otherwise become too vast. It is easy to speak of systems, trade, climate, empires, and migrations until the people disappear behind the explanation. Ugarit brings them back. It shows a city still functioning until it no longer can. It shows the final interval between knowledge and destruction. It shows that collapse is not only the moment when walls fall, but the moment when help becomes impossible. After the fire, the tablets remain. They lie in rooms where scribes once worked, in archives that no longer serve any living administration. The city's alphabet, its legal records, its prayers, its diplomatic messages, and its last anxieties wait under debris for thousands of years. When they emerge again, they do not solve the Bronze Age collapse, but they make it intimate. They remind us that the end of a civilization is experienced not as an abstract transformation, but as a message sent into danger, a gate watched in fear, a missing fleet, a king without enough time, and a city listening for help across a darkening sea. The name Sea Peoples has become one of the most famous and misleading labels in ancient history. It sounds clear, almost cinematic, as if one enormous nation rose from the waves and swept across the Bronze Age world with a single purpose. But the ancient evidence does not give us anything that simple. The phrase is modern. It gathers together several groups mentioned in Egyptian inscriptions, especially during the reigns of Meneptah and Rameses III, and turns them into one convenient mystery. The convenience is useful, but dangerous. It can make a complicated age of migration, warfare, collapse, and survival look like a single invasion story. Egyptian records describe foreign groups attacking or entering Egypt by land and sea. Some names recur in discussions of the collapsed Shurden, Shekelesh, Luka, Tursha, Peliset, Jeker, Denian, Weshesh, and others, depending on the inscription and period. The spellings vary because these are Egyptian renderings of foreign names, filtered through royal propaganda and the limits of ancient writing. Some of these groups may have come from the Aegean, Anatolia, Cyprus, the central Mediterranean, or the Levant. Some may have been displaced populations rather than professional invaders. Some may have served as mercenaries before becoming enemies. Scholars still debate their origins, and no single map can place them all with certainty. The Egyptian version of events is dramatic. In the inscriptions of Rameses III at Medinet Habu, the pharaoh presents himself as the defender of Egypt against a vast confederation of enemies who have overthrown lands before reaching his borders. The scenes show ships, warriors, families, carts, oxen, weapons, and battle. The message is clear: chaos comes from outside, and Pharaoh defeats it. But Egyptian royal inscriptions are not neutral newspapers. They are monuments to kingship. They magnify danger in order to magnify victory. They arrange events so that Pharaoh stands at the center of cosmic order, crushing the forces that threaten Egypt and the gods. Yet propaganda is not the same as fiction. The records almost certainly reflect real pressure. Egypt did fight dangerous enemies. People were moving. Warfare took place. The state felt threatened enough to carve the events into temple walls with great force. The challenge is separating the historical crisis from the royal performance. What exactly happened beyond Egypt's borders? Were these groups the destroyers of the Hittite Empire, Ugarit, Cyprus, and the Mycenaean palaces? Or were they partly a result of those destructions, people uprooted by famine, war, and the failure of palace systems? The evidence remains incomplete, and the answer may be both in different places. One of the most important details in the Egyptian scenes is the presence of families and possessions. Some depictions and texts suggest not only raiding warriors, but migrating communities, people travelling with carts and households. That does not fit neatly with the image of pirates alone. It suggests displacement. it suggests that at least some of the people approaching Egypt were not merely seeking plunder, but land, food, security, or a new place in a world that had stopped supporting them. Hunger can turn farmers into migrants, migrants into armed groups, and armed groups into conquerors or refugees depending on who writes the record. This is why the Sea People's problem cannot be separated from the wider collapse. If drought reduces harvests, if palaces fail, if trade breaks down, if local wars multiply, if elites can no longer feed or employ dependents, people move. They do not move as abstract arrows on a historian's map. They move with children, animals, tools, memories, and fear. Along the way, they may raid, bargain, hire themselves as soldiers, settle, fight, or be absorbed into other communities. To the state they threaten, they become enemies. To themselves, they may be survivors. Some of the named groups had histories before the final crisis. The Sherden, for example, appear earlier as both enemies and mercenaries in Egyptian service. This is a lesser-known but revealing detail. A group could fight Egypt in one generation and serve Egypt in another. Or perhaps different members of a broader identity could do both. Late Bronze Age ethnicity and political identity were not always fixed in modern terms. Names may describe peoples, regions, warrior bands, coalitions, or labels imposed by outsiders. A warrior's identity could shift with employment, alliance, settlement, and opportunity. The world was fluid even before it collapsed. The Peliset are especially important because many scholars connect them with the Philistines, who later appear in the southern Levant. Archaeology in Philistine cities such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath shows new cultural elements in the early Iron Age, including Aegean-style pottery and other practices that suggest some connection with the Aegean or Eastern Mediterranean migration. But even here, the story is not simple. These communities quickly become part of the local Levantine world, blending influences rather than preserving a pure foreign culture. Migration does not freeze people in their place of origin. It creates new identities. The Sea Peoples, then, are not best understood as a single mysterious horde that caused the collapse by itself. They are better seen as one visible part of a broader age of disruption. They may have destroyed some cities. They may have exploited weakened kingdoms. They may have been pushed by the same conditions that weakened those kingdoms. They may have included warriors, refugees, sailors, displaced farmers, mercenaries, and opportunists. The label hides variety. It turns many human stories into one dramatic shadow. Egypt's survival also complicates the picture. Rameses III claims victory, and Egypt does endure, but the victory is not the beginning of renewed greatness. After this period, Egypt's power declines. Its influence in the Levant weakens. Economic problems deepen. Internal strains grow. Even the state that defeats the invaders does not escape the age undamaged. The walls hold, but the world beyond them has changed. A successful defense against one crisis does not restore the international system that made the Old Bronze Age possible. This is the central problem with blaming the Sea Peoples alone. If they were simply conquerors, one might expect a clearer pattern of replacement. Instead, the archaeological record shows a mosaic destruction here, continuity there, migration in one region, local adaptation in another, old cultures transformed rather than erased. Some cities burn before the major Egyptian battles. Some disruptions cannot be tied directly to seaborne attackers. Some inland collapses require explanations beyond maritime invasion. No single enemy can be everywhere at once, doing everything, in exactly the form later imagination desires. Still, the image remains powerful because it captures something real about the terror of the time. For coastal cities, danger did come from the sea. Ships could bring wealth in one season and armed strangers in the next. The horizon itself became uncertain. A sail was no longer only a sign of trade or diplomacy. It might be hunger arriving, or war, or a people with nowhere else to go. In a world where palaces depended on controlled movement, uncontrolled movement was revolutionary. The Sea People's problem endures because it sits at the border between evidence and imagination. Egyptian walls give names and images, but not enough context. Burned cities give destruction, but not always attackers. Pottery gives movement, but not the full story of identity. Later histories give echoes, but not reliable memory. What survives in the record suggests not one people, not one invasion, not one simple cause, but a crisis of movement in an age when movement itself had become dangerous. And so the sea becomes both road and wound. It carries copper, grain, envoys, brides, gifts, soldiers, and letters, as it had for generations. Then it carries fear. The same water that once tied the Bronze Age world together now helps transmit its unravelling. On Egyptian temple walls, Pharaoh defeats the enemy and restores order. Beyond the carved victory, however, the old order is already gone. The collapse of the Bronze Age is often remembered in fire, but some of its deepest causes may have begun without flame, without armies, without any visible enemy at the gate. They may have begun in the sky, in the soil, in the slow failure of rains that had once seemed uncertain but dependable enough. A field does not collapse dramatically, it dries. A river does not announce political crisis, it shrinks. A harvest does not write a warning tablet, it simply comes in too small. And then the people who depend on it must decide what can be eaten, what can be stored, what can be taxed, what can be sacrificed, and what must be abandoned. Drought is one of the most debated explanations for the Bronze Age collapse, because it is both powerful and incomplete. Modern climate studies, using evidence such as pollen, lake sediments, speleothems, and other environmental records, suggest that parts of the eastern Mediterranean experienced arid conditions around the end of the late Bronze Age. The exact timing and regional severity remain debated, and the evidence does not point to one simple climate event that struck every kingdom equally. But the possibility of prolonged or repeated drought matters, because these societies lived close to agricultural limits. Their palaces could display gold, bronze, ivory, and diplomatic splendor, yet beneath all of it lay grain. Grain is the quiet foundation of kingship. It feeds palace workers, soldiers, craftsmen, priests, sailors, and dependent laborers. It fills storerooms that allow rulers to survive bad seasons and reward loyalty. It supports festivals, offerings, rations, and military campaigns. It is counted by scribes with the same seriousness as weapons and metal, because food is power in its most basic form. A king may speak in the language of divine favour, but if the granary is empty, divine favour begins to look negotiable. A single bad harvest can be absorbed if the system is strong. Stored grain can be released. Trade can bring supplies. Taxes can be adjusted, though rulers rarely enjoy doing so. Communities can stretch food, slaughter animals, gather wild plants, and endure. Ancient people were not helpless before environmental stress. They had strategies, memories, and practical knowledge. But repeated harvest failures are different. They turn resilience into exhaustion. Seed grain is eaten. Livestock herds shrink, Debts deepen. Families leave land that can no longer support them. Local officials face impossible demands from above and desperation from below. The Late Bronze Age palace system is especially vulnerable because it depends on surplus. Surplus is what allows some people to specialize instead of farm. It allows scribes to write, smiths to work, soldiers to train, priests to serve temples, and rulers to build monumental architecture. Surplus supports complexity. When surplus contracts, complexity becomes expensive. The palace does not immediately disappear, but it begins to consume the very communities that sustain it. The demands continue, because the palace must feed its dependents and maintain its status. But the margin that made those demands tolerable narrows. In rain-fed regions such as parts of Anatolia, Syria, the Levant, and the Aegean, changes in precipitation could have been devastating. Egypt, with the Nile, had a different agricultural foundation, but it was not immune to food stress, especially if regional trade and political stability were weakening. The Hittite world may have faced grain shortages serious enough to require imports. Coastal cities such as Ugarit depended not only on local agriculture, but also on the stability of inland and maritime supply. If drought affected several regions at once, then trade could not easily solve the problem, because everyone needed the same thing at the same time. This is one of the cruel dynamics of widespread environmental stress. In normal hardship, a struggling city can buy grain from a more fortunate neighbor. In regional hardship, neighbors also struggle. Prices rise. Ships become more valuable and more tempting targets. Rulers compete for supplies. Merchants take greater risks. Raiding becomes more attractive. Migration increases. Hunger does not remain politely in the fields. It moves into politics, warfare, and trade. The evidence remains incomplete, and no responsible account can say that drought alone destroyed the Bronze Age world. Cities do not burn simply because rain fails. Empires do not dissolve automatically because fields are dry. People can endure terrible environmental conditions when institutions adapt, share burdens, and maintain legitimacy. But drought can weaken every joint in a society at once. It reduces food, strains labor, encourages movement, undermines trust, increases conflict, and exposes the limits of central power. It is not always the hand that strikes the final blow. It is the force that makes every blow harder to survive. There is also a psychological dimension that rarely appears directly in the evidence. In societies where kings are linked to gods, cosmic order, fertility, and protection, environmental failure is not merely practical, it is symbolic. If the rains fail, if the fields wither, if famine spreads, people may wonder whether the gods are angry, whether rituals have failed, whether the king has lost favor, whether obedience still makes sense. The palace's authority is built partly on the promise that it stands between chaos and the community. When chaos enters anyway, the promise weakens. One can imagine the effect in a village tied to a palace centre. The harvest is poor. Officials arrive to collect what is owed. The people have less than expected, but the palace's needs have not vanished. There are soldiers to feed, temples to supply, workers to ration, elites to satisfy. Perhaps the collectors take what they can. Perhaps they negotiate. Perhaps they threaten. Perhaps the villagers hide grain, flee, resist, or comply until compliance becomes impossible. The records, when they survive, usually preserve the palace's view, not the villagers' fear. Yet the crisis must have been lived most sharply at that level, in households deciding how to last until another season. Famine also changes movement. People leave not because they love uncertainty, but because staying becomes worse. Some move towards cities, hoping for rations. Some move away from cities, hoping to escape demands. Some join armed groups. Some become labourers, dependents, refugees, raiders, settlers. Their identities shift under pressure. A farmer without land may become a migrant. A migrant denied food may become an enemy. A displaced warrior may serve one king, then another, then no king at all. This is how environmental stress can feed the human movements later remembered as invasions. The Sea Peoples, the fall of Ugarit, the weakening of Hatti, the stress in Egypt, the disruption of trade, and the destruction of palaces all become harder to understand if separated from the possibility of hunger, not because hunger explains everything, but because hunger makes everything more combustible. A well-fed army fights differently from a starving one. A loyal vassal with full storerooms behaves differently from a desperate one. A city with secure supplies can withstand a siege. A city already hungry may break quickly. A palace with surplus can buy loyalty. A palace without surplus can only demand it. There is a lesser-known lesson here about ancient complexity. We tend to admire great civilizations for what they build: upward walls, temples, palaces, archives, armies, trade networks. But their survival depends on what comes upward from the soil. The most elaborate diplomatic system of the Bronze Age still rests on rain falling at the right time. The most impressive citadel still depends on fields beyond its walls. The most powerful king still needs farmers whose names are not carved into monuments. As the dry years press on, whether gradually or in pulses, the world begins to lose its buffer. The palace can no longer absorb shocks as easily. Trade cannot compensate for every shortage. Diplomacy cannot conjure harvests. Walls cannot defend against empty granaries. In the archives, the concern may appear as shipments, rations, requests, and lists. In the fields, it appears as dust, thin animals, anxious families, and the bitter knowledge that tomorrow may not resemble yesterday after all. The Bronze Age collapse was not caused by the weather alone, but in the drying fields and shrinking margins, the night grows closer. Before the palaces burn, the land itself may already be whispering that the old order has become too heavy for the world beneath it. The earth may have shaken before some of the cities burned. That possibility has always given the Bronze Age collapse a darker, more elemental quality, because it suggests that the old world was not only attacked by people or weakened by hunger, but also struck by the ground beneath its own walls. In a region where tectonic faults run through Anatolia, the Aegean, Cyprus, the Levant, and the eastern Mediterranean, earthquakes are not rare visitors. They are part of the deep character of the landscape. The same mountains, harbours, and coastlines that shape trade and power were also formed by forces capable of tearing buildings apart in moments. The debated idea, sometimes called an earthquake storm, proposes that a cluster of major earthquakes may have damaged multiple late Bronze Age sites within a relatively limited period. The phrase does not mean one earthquake travelling like an army from city to city. It means a sequence of seismic events along active fault systems, perhaps over decades, with each disaster striking societies that were already under other forms of stress. This is important, because an earthquake by itself does not usually explain the collapse of an entire civilization. Ancient people rebuilt after earthquakes many times, but an earthquake that arrives during drought, war, trade failure, political unrest, and migration can become more than a natural disaster. It can become the shock that pushes weakened structures past repair. Archaeologists look for earthquake damage carefully, because collapsed walls alone are not enough. A city can be destroyed by siege, fire, abandonment, later quarrying, poor construction, or simple decay. Signs that may suggest seismic destruction include walls fallen in particular directions, crushed skeletons beneath debris, tilted or displaced masonry, cracked floors, sudden collapse without clear evidence of attack, and damage patterns across a site that fit ground shaking better than warfare. Even then, certainty can be elusive. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate which destruction layers should be attributed to earthquakes and which should not. In places such as Mycenae, Tiryns, Medea, Troy, and other sites across the Aegean and Anatolia, earthquake damage has been proposed for certain phases. Some structures show collapse that may fit seismic events. At Medea, for example, destruction around the late 13th century BCE has been interpreted by some researchers as earthquake-related, with signs of sudden structural failure. At Tiryns, damage and rebuilding complicate the picture. At Troy, long famous for its layers of destruction and later legend, different phases have been linked to different causes, including earthquake and warfare. But these interpretations are not universally accepted in every case, and the temptation to blame a dramatic event must always be balanced against the messy reality of ruins. What makes earthquakes so dangerous in a palace world is not only the first collapse of stone and mud brick, it is what comes after. Walls must be rebuilt, storehouses may be damaged, grain may be lost, water systems may fail, roads may be blocked, temples may need repair, workers must be diverted from fields to reconstruction. Elites must prove that they still command resources. If a palace is strong, this rebuilding can even reinforce authority. The king restores order. The gods are honoured. The walls rise again, but if the palace is already struggling, earthquake damage can expose its weakness in public. A cracked gate is a political message, whether anyone intends it or not. Earthquakes also disturb memory and belief. In ancient societies, natural disasters are rarely understood in purely mechanical terms. Shaking earth can be read as divine anger, cosmic disorder, or a sign that rituals have failed. Priests may respond with offerings. Kings may commission repairs and ceremonies. People may fear that the gods have withdrawn protection. The psychological shock is difficult to measure archaeologically, but it matters. A society already anxious about hunger and enemies may experience earthquake damage not as one isolated misfortune, but as another sign that the world is losing coherence. Still, earthquakes cannot explain everything. They do not account for the disappearance of writing in Greece, the full political collapse of Hatti, the final messages of Ugarit, Egyptian battles against migrating groups, or widespread trade disruption by themselves. They do not choose palace systems over villages. They do not create drought. They do not name the attackers who may have burned certain cities. If every destruction layer is forced into the earthquake explanation, the theory becomes too broad to be useful. Natural disaster is part of the story, not the whole story. The more convincing possibility is interaction. A major quake damages a city. Reconstruction requires labour and grain. Grain is already short. Trade is already unstable. Enemies or rivals notice weakness. Refugees arrive. Local workers resent new demands. A second shock strikes a nearby region. The palace borrows resources from one district to repair another. Vassals become less responsive. Merchants avoid unsafe routes. A city that might have recovered in a calm century instead slips into permanent decline. In this version, the earthquake is not the villain. It is the blow that reveals how fragile the body has become. There is a lesser-known detail in this kind of collapse rebuilding can be a burden as much as a sign of resilience. Modern observers often see reconstruction as recovery, and sometimes it is. But to rebuild a palace wall, someone must cut timber, quarry stone, make bricks, haul materials, provide food for labourers, supervise work, and protect the site while repairs continue. If the state forces these demands onto communities already weakened by poor harvests, rebuilding may deepen the crisis. The restored wall may stand, but the social bargain beneath it may crack further. In some Mycenaean centres, engineering works and fortification efforts near the end of the palatial period suggest concern with defence and survival. Protected water access at citadels such as Mycenaean Tiryns has often been discussed in relation to insecurity, whether that insecurity comes from human enemies, earthquake damage, internal disorder, or a mixture of pressures. The result is the same: elite centres are investing in survival infrastructure. The world feels dangerous enough that water itself must be defended inside stone. The landscape after an earthquake would have been full of practical hazards: collapsed roofs, broken storage jars, fires from overturned lamps or hearths, dust in the air, injured people trapped under beams, animals loose in courtyards, sacred objects damaged, wells blocked or contaminated, roads cracked, walls no longer trustworthy. In such moments, authority is tested immediately. Who organises rescue? Who distributes food? Who repairs the gate? Who guards against looters? Who explains why the gods allowed it? A state can survive the shaking only if it can answer these questions quickly enough. Across the Bronze Age world, some communities surely did rebuild. Not every damaged site died. Some people returned to cracked houses, cleared debris, replastered walls, and resumed planting. This matters because human resilience is as much a part of the archaeological record as destruction. But resilience has limits. When earthquakes are layered onto drought, migration, raiding, failing trade, and political fragmentation, recovery becomes uneven. Some centres manage another generation. Others never regain their former scale. Others are abandoned for safer or more practical locations. The map shifts not only because cities are destroyed, but because people decide where life can still be maintained. The earthquake question therefore teaches caution. It reminds us that the Bronze Age collapse was not purely a human drama, even though human choices shaped it at every step. The physical world was active, climate shifted, seas carried danger, faults moved, fields failed, mountains and coastlines were not backdrops, they were participants. But it also reminds us that disasters do not strike empty stages. They strike societies with existing inequalities, dependencies, strengths, and weaknesses. The same earthquake can be a tragedy in one place and a civilizational turning point in another, depending on what it hits. So the broken walls speak, but softly. Some may speak of armies, some of fire, some of abandonment, some of the ground suddenly moving beneath people who had trusted stone to stand still. No single explanation fully accounts for the pattern, yet the possibility of earthquakes adds another layer to the gathering darkness. In a world where kings claim to hold order, the earth itself may have answered with disorder, and once the walls cracked, everyone could see what the palace could no longer hide. Not every enemy comes from beyond the horizon. Some are born in the fields, workshops, barracks, and storerooms of the very societies that later described themselves as victims of attack. The Bronze Age palaces were powerful, but they were also demanding. They collected, counted, stored, redistributed, commanded, and consumed. They promised protection and order, yet they required labour, obedience, taxes, military service, and faith in a hierarchy that placed kings and elites close to the gods, while ordinary people carried the weight of the system on their backs. When the world was prosperous, that bargain could hold. When pressure mounted, it could begin to look less like order and more like extraction. The evidence for internal rebellion during the Bronze Age collapse is difficult to handle, because the people most likely to rebel rarely left their own explanations in archives. Palace records speak in the voice of administrators. Royal inscriptions speak in the voice of kings. Even when texts mention enemies, rebels, or disorder, they often do so through elite language designed to defend authority. A ruler does not usually admit that his subjects have reasonable grievances. He describes them as traitors, criminals, foreigners, or servants of chaos. Archaeology, meanwhile, can show destruction, abandonment, or changes in settlement. But it cannot always tell whether a palace was burned by invaders, local rebels, rival elites, or a mixture of frightened people acting in a moment that left no written confession behind. Still, the possibility of internal fracture cannot be ignored. Palace societies concentrate wealth and authority. They also concentrate resentment when conditions worsen. Farmers may resent grain demands during poor harvests. Craftsmen may depend on palace rations but suffer when supplies fail. Soldiers and mercenaries may become dangerous if unpaid or underfed. Local elites may see central weakness as an opportunity. Subject towns may decide that loyalty to a distant king no longer offers enough protection. The system that once gathered resources toward the centre may, under strain, begin pulling itself apart. In Mycenaean Greece, the disappearance of palace administration after the destructions raises questions that invasion alone cannot answer. The palaces burn or decline, but local populations do not simply vanish. Some communities continue, though altered. This suggests that the collapse was not only a matter of outsiders replacing insiders. It involved the breakdown of a political and economic order within the Greek mainland itself. The Linear B tablets show a society of careful control, with workers, land, animals, offerings, weapons, and supplies organized through palatial oversight. Such a system may have been efficient, but efficiency can become rigidity. When crisis arrives, tightly controlled systems sometimes adapt poorly because too much depends on central command. The tablets preserve hints of hierarchy. They list groups of workers, including women in dependent labor arrangements, sometimes with children, receiving rations. They record allocations and obligations without telling us how those people felt about them. This is one of the lesser-known but important human shadows in the record. Behind the grandeur of Mycenaean citadels were people whose lives were measured in grain portions and work assignments. When food shortages, warfare, or administrative failure struck, these dependent groups may have suffered first, whether they rebelled, fled, starved, were moved, or were absorbed into new communities. The evidence remains incomplete. But their vulnerability reminds us that collapse is not experienced evenly. In the Hittite world, internal tension also mattered. The empire had a long history of dynastic disputes, court intrigue, and difficulties managing vassals. A Hittite king had to maintain legitimacy among royal relatives, nobles, military commanders, priests, and subject rulers. Oaths and treaties were tools of control precisely because loyalty could not be assumed. If the centre weakened, those outer bonds could snap quickly. A vassal who once feared imperial punishment might delay tribute, negotiate with rivals, or declare independence. A frontier commander might act for himself. A subject people might refuse further demands. From the capital's perspective, this would look like disorder. From the local perspective, it might look like survival. Overtaxation and forced labour are hard to prove in any specific destruction layer, but they are part of the structural background. Palaces need workers for agriculture, construction, craft production, military support, and transport. During crisis, they often demand more precisely when people have less to give. A wall damaged by earthquake must be repaired. A harvest failure requires tighter collection. A threatened frontier needs soldiers. A temple requires offerings to restore divine favour. Each demand may seem necessary from above. From below, the accumulation can become unbearable. There is also the danger of militarization. As insecurity rises, rulers rely more heavily on armed men, palace guards, chariot warriors, infantry, mercenaries, and allied forces. Armed men can defend the state, but they can also destabilize it if loyalty becomes uncertain. Mercenaries are especially ambiguous. The late Bronze Age world already shows examples of foreign warriors serving great kings. The Shurden, for instance, appear in Egyptian service as well as in hostile contexts. This fluidity is revealing. Men trained for violence could move between roles depending on payment, opportunity, capture, settlement, or desperation. In a collapsing world, the line between soldier, raider, refugee, and rebel grows thin. Migration adds another internal pressure. A city receiving displaced people must decide whether to feed, employ, expel, enslave, or fight them. New arrivals can strengthen a community if integrated successfully, but they can also strain food supplies and social order. Local people may fear them, elites may recruit them, rivals may exploit them. Some groups labelled as foreign enemies may have spent years moving through the same regions, serving different powers, marrying locally, and becoming part of the social fabric before conflict erupted. Identity in such moments is not a fixed label carved in stone. It is negotiated under stress. The collapse of authority can also release local violence. When courts no longer function, debts may be settled by force. When roads are unsafe, merchants travel armed or not at all. When granaries are threatened, guards may become looters. When the palace cannot punish crime, old grievances return. A society does not need a massive foreign invasion to become dangerous. It only needs enough people to believe that the rules no longer protect them. Yet it would be too simple to turn the Bronze Age collapse into a tale of popular revolution. There is no clear evidence of a coordinated class uprising across the Eastern Mediterranean. The phrase would impose modern categories too heavily on ancient societies. What is more plausible is fragmentation, local rebellions, elite rivalries, worker flight, vassal defection, mercenary disorder, opportunistic raiding, and ordinary refusal spreading through systems already weakened by other pressures. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but internal fracture helps explain why some palaces could not recover even after the immediate danger passed. The palace, after all, is not only a building, it is a relationship. It exists because people bring grain to it, work for it, fight for it, fear it, honour it, and believe, however uneasily, that it remains necessary. When that belief erodes, the walls may still stand for a while, but the institution is already hollowing out. A king can order loyalty, but he cannot manufacture trust from empty storerooms. He can punish rebels, but punishment requires soldiers who must themselves be loyal and fed. He can invoke the gods, but divine authority weakens when the people see hunger ruin, and defeat. So rebellion inside the gates may not always have looked like a mob storming a palace. It may have looked like workers disappearing from assignments, villages hiding grain, soldiers changing sides, vassals ignoring messages, local chiefs taking control, merchants avoiding official channels, and desperate people choosing movement over obedience. It may have looked like the slow withdrawal of consent from a system that had once seemed eternal. When the fires finally came, some may have been lit by outsiders, some by rivals, some by accident, some perhaps by people who knew the rooms from within. The ruins do not always say, but the silence after the flame suggests that the old bargain between palace and people had failed in many places. The Bronze Age did not only face enemies at sea, drought in the fields, and earthquakes under its walls. It faced the possibility that those who had carried civilization's weight no longer could, or no longer would. The Bronze Age collapse becomes most understandable when it's seen not as one disaster, but as a network failing in motion. A drought does not have to destroy every kingdom if trade still works, if granaries are full, if rulers cooperate, if people trust the system. An invasion does not have to end an age if states can regroup, pay soldiers, rebuild walls, and maintain supply. An earthquake does not have to become a historical turning point if labor, food, and authority remain strong enough to repair the damage. But when each pressure weakens the ability to answer the next, crisis begins to multiply. The problem is no longer one broken part. It is the way the broken parts begin breaking one another. The late Bronze Age world had grown powerful through connection. That connection moved copper, tin, grain, timber, horses, luxury goods, scribes, royal daughters, treaties, gods, stories, and military knowledge across wide distances. It allowed palaces to become richer and more specialized than they could have been alone. It created a diplomatic culture in which great kings recognized one another, and smaller rulers sought protection inside larger structures of power. It made cities like Ugarit wealthy, Cyprus essential, Egypt influential, Hatti formidable, and Mycenaean palaces part of a wider prestige economy. Yet the same connection that carried prosperity could carry failure. A simple village, poor and isolated, may suffer terribly from a bad harvest. But its problems remain local unless people leave. A palace system is different. It gathers food from many communities, redistributes supplies to specialists, and depends on materials from beyond its immediate territory. Its strength lies in coordination. Its weakness lies in the need for coordination to continue. If grain shortages reduce surplus, dependent workers suffer. If workers suffer, production falters. If production falters, elites lose goods needed for reward and exchange. If exchange weakens, alliances and trade relationships fray. If trade routes become unsafe, metal supplies shrink. If metal supplies shrink, military and agricultural tools become harder to maintain. If the army weakens, borders become more dangerous. If borders become dangerous, trade becomes even less reliable. The circle tightens. This is the logic of cascading collapse. No single explanation fully accounts for the Bronze Age world's unravelling, because the causes did not remain separate. They interacted. Drought could encourage migration. Migration could increase conflict. Conflict could disrupt trade. Trade disruption could weaken palace economies. Weakened palace economies could make rulers more demanding. Increased demands could fuel rebellion or flight. Rebellion could make states less able to defend themselves. Failed defense could invite attack. Attack could create more refugees. Refugees could carry the crisis elsewhere. What begins as pressure becomes transmission. The surprising detail is that complexity itself can hide danger. A sophisticated system has more ways to solve problems, but also more ways for problems to spread. The great kings of the late Bronze Age had diplomats, archives, specialized craftsmen, chariot forces, vassal treaties, and long-distance exchange. These were real strengths. They allowed their societies to reach impressive levels of organization, but they also created dependencies that ordinary eyes may not have noticed until they failed. A palace official waiting for tin does not control the distant route that brings it. A coastal king waiting for grain cannot command rain inland. A scribe recording rations cannot make the harvest larger. A treaty with a vassal cannot guarantee loyalty if the imperial army is too far away or too hungry to march. Systems often fail at the edges first. A frontier town is raided. A harbour becomes unsafe. A vassal delays tribute. A merchant chooses not to sail. A road is abandoned. These events may seem minor to the centre at first. The capital still stands. The palace still counts. The king still receives offerings. But the edges are where information arrives earliest and least clearly. By the time the centre fully understands that the pattern has changed, the damage may already be feeding on itself. The royal court may respond to each problem as if it is isolated, never seeing that the isolation is the illusion. The final letters from places like Ugarit show this tragic delay. The city still believes in communication because communication has always been the tool of survival. Send a message, request aid, warn an ally, report danger, ask where the ships are. But in a systems crisis, messages travel through the same weakened network that needs to rescue them. Help may be promised but unable to move. Ships may exist but be elsewhere. Allies may care but be busy saving themselves. The old reflexes continue after the world that made them effective has already begun to disappear. Economic specialization deepens the risk. Palace centers support people who do not produce their own food: scribes, metal workers, textile workers, chariot makers, soldiers, priests, servants, and elite households. In prosperous times, specialization creates wealth and cultural brilliance. In crisis, it creates dependence. If the palace cannot provide rations, dependent workers scatter or starve. If specialists scatter, the palace loses capacity. Once a system loses the people who know how to operate it, rebuilding becomes harder even if the physical buildings remain. The loss of writing in parts of post-palatial Greece illustrates this sharply. The people did not lose the biological ability to write. The institutions that required and supported that writing disappeared. Legitimacy is another part of the network, though it cannot be dug from the ground as easily as pottery. A king's authority depends on more than force. It depends on the belief that he can maintain order, mediate with the gods, protect the land, reward followers, punish enemies, and keep the world intelligible. When drought, invasion, famine, earthquake, and defeat arrive together, legitimacy suffers. The ruler may still sit on a throne, but the throne means less if the palace cannot feed workers, defend roads, answer allies, or explain disaster. Once legitimacy weakens, every other crisis becomes harder to manage. This is why the collapse did not need every city to fall in the same way. A systems crisis produces varied ruins. One palace burns in war. Another is abandoned because supply fails. Another suffers earthquake damage and never recovers because labor is gone. Another survives but loses its old regional role. Another becomes smaller, poorer, more local. From the ground, the pattern looks uneven. from above. The shared feature is the breakdown of connection and central coordination. The Bronze Age world does not collapse like a single tower. It collapses like a bridge system, losing supports one by one until the surviving spans can no longer carry weight. The old international order depended on confidence that the routes would remain open, the harvests sufficient, the kings recognizable, the gifts meaningful, the treaties enforceable, and the gods properly honored. During the collapse, each of these assumptions becomes less reliable. The world does not forget itself all at once. It forgets through interruptions, a route no longer used, a script no longer taught, a palace no longer repaired, a diplomatic title no longer meaningful, a harbour no longer safe. A generation grows up for whom the old system is not a living reality but a memory attached to ruins. Yet this failure is not the same as total destruction. It is transformation through loss. People remain, but they live in different networks. Local communities become more important. New identities form. Old imperial centres lose their grip. Iron begins to matter more. Smaller polities emerge where great palaces once commanded. The collapse is therefore both an ending and a redistribution of possibility. The Bronze Age machine fails together, but human life continues outside the machine. That may be the most unsettling lesson. Civilization can be real, brilliant, and fragile at the same time. Its fragility does not mean it was foolish. The late Bronze Age world achieved something remarkable: an international system of trade, diplomacy, administration, and cultural exchange across difficult landscapes. But the very sophistication that made it shine also made it vulnerable to cascading failure. It was not destroyed by one night. It entered a night made of many smaller darknesses, each deepening the next, until the old world could no longer find its way back to morning. After the palaces fall, life does not end. That is one of the easiest truths to forget when staring at burned archives and broken walls. The old world is gone, but the people who survive still wake into mornings that require food, shelter, tools, decisions, and memory. They salvage beams from ruined buildings. They reuse stones from abandoned halls. They plant fields where authority has weakened. They carry pottery styles, songs, gods, and family stories into smaller settlements. They bury their dead under new customs. They move through landscapes where the names of kings no longer open roads. The collapse is immense, but it is not emptiness. It is a world learning how to live without the structures that once claimed to make life possible. In many regions, the immediate aftermath looks poorer, smaller, and more local. The grand palace economies no longer coordinate production on the same scale. Long-distance exchange contracts or changes shape. Luxury goods become rarer. Monumental building declines in some areas. Writing disappears from parts of the Aegean because the administrative system that had required it has vanished. In Greece, Linear B is no longer used, and for several centuries the written record falls silent. This silence can make the post-palatial period seem darker than it truly was, because people continue living beyond the reach of surviving texts. Archaeological traces remain pottery, graves, settlement shifts, tools, houses, and small signs of adaptation. But the voice of the palace scribe is gone. That loss of writing is not simply a cultural failure. It reveals how deeply writing had been tied to centralized administration. Linear B had not been a general literary script used by everyone for letters, poetry, and public memory. It served palatial needs: counting, allocating, storing, organizing. When the palaces no longer functioned, the script lost its institutional home. People did not become incapable of intelligence or memory. They no longer lived inside a system that paid scribes to record wheels, grain, oil, armor, workers, and offerings. The silence is therefore not the silence of human thought. It is the silence of a particular bureaucracy. In the ruins of Mycenaean Greece, communities continue in altered form. Some settlements shrink or move. Some regions become more dispersed. Old citadels may still be occupied, but their political meaning changes. The world becomes less centralized, less visibly wealthy, and perhaps more insecure. Later Greeks would look back toward a heroic age, remembering great warriors, distant expeditions, fortified cities, and ancestral kings. The poems that eventually emerge are not straightforward history, but they seem to preserve a cultural memory that something grand once stood before the age of smaller communities. Myth does not give us a clear photograph, but it can carry the emotional outline of loss. In Anatolia and northern Syria, the story is different. The Hittite Empire collapses, but Hittite and Luwian traditions persist in successor states. These Neo-Hittite kingdoms maintain inscriptions, royal imagery, and political forms that echo the imperial past while belonging to a new Iron Age landscape. The centre at Hattusa is gone, but the fragments of its world remain active elsewhere. This is one of the most important corrections to the idea of total disappearance. Empires die. But cultures often scatter and recombine. A collapsed capital can no longer command, yet its symbols may still speak from new courts, new monuments, and new rulers claiming pieces of old legitimacy. Along the Levantine coast, the aftermath produces new maritime powers. The Phoenician cities, including places such as Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, rise in importance during the early Iron Age, eventually becoming famous for trade, seafaring, craft production, and the spread of alphabetic writing. They inherit and transform older coastal traditions rather than appearing from nowhere. In a world where the old palace networks have failed, flexible city-based commerce may offer advantages, smaller. Adaptable maritime communities can move through the spaces left by fallen empires. The sea that carried danger during the collapse becomes again a road, though under different rules. In the southern Levant, new identities take shape as well. The Philistines appear in the coastal plain, with material culture showing links to the wider Aegean or eastern Mediterranean before blending into the local environment. Inland, early Israelite communities emerge in the highlands, visible archaeologically through settlement patterns, material culture, and later textual traditions that must be handled carefully. The evidence remains incomplete, and the formation of these peoples is debated. But the broad picture is clear enough. The collapse opens political and social space. Where Egyptian influence weakens and Canaanite city-state systems transform, new communities form, compete, settle, and remember themselves into history. Iron also becomes part of the New Age, though the transition from bronze to iron is often misunderstood. Iron does not instantly replace bronze because it is obviously superior in every way. Early iron working is technically demanding, and early iron objects are not always better than bronze ones. But iron ore is far more widely available than tin, and over time that matters enormously. In a world where long-distance tin supply has become vulnerable, iron offers a different material future. The spread of iron technology is gradual, uneven, and shaped by local skill, need, and opportunity. Still, the early Iron Age that follows the collapse is not only a poorer continuation of the Bronze Age, it is the beginning of a new technological and political landscape. For ordinary survivors, these large transformations would have been felt in practical terms. A tool is repaired differently, a trade object becomes rare, A local chief matters more than a distant king. A ruined palace becomes a source of stone, memory, fear, or legend. A road once protected by imperial authority becomes unsafe or irrelevant. A temple may continue, change, or be abandoned. A family may carry old customs into new settlements without knowing that future historians will call their lifetime a transition between ages. People rarely experience themselves as living in an aftermath. They experience themselves as trying to continue. There is a strange resilience in this. The Bronze Age palace system collapses, but agriculture continues. Potters continue shaping clay. Sailors continue reading wind. Smiths continue working metal. Parents continue teaching children where water is found, which fields can be planted, which ruins to avoid, which stories matter. The end of complexity is not the end of culture. It is a painful reduction in some forms of organization and a reorientation toward others. Some knowledge is lost. Some is preserved in households rather than archives. Some is transformed so thoroughly that its origin becomes invisible. The survivors also live with ruins that must have shaped imagination. A child growing up near a shattered citadel sees walls too large for the present community to build. A farmer ploughing near a destroyed palace turns up fragments of painted pottery or seal stones. A shepherd shelters animals beside stones carved for forgotten rulers. Such landscapes create memory without explanation. They invite stories. They teach that people before were powerful, that gods or enemies or fate brought them down. That stone can outlast names. Over generations, history becomes legend, and legend becomes part of identity. Egypt remains, but even Egypt is changed. It survives the invasions and pressures of the period, yet its imperial reach in Asia diminishes. The new kingdom's great outward power fades, and later centuries bring internal division, economic strain, and foreign influence. Survival is not the same as untouched continuity. Egypt's temples still stand, its scribes still write, its kings still claim cosmic order. But the world in which Egypt had once played the role of supreme golden power among royal brothers has gone. The international club of late Bronze Age great kings no longer exists in its old form. Assyria, farther inland, eventually rises to tremendous power in later centuries, but its trajectory belongs to a changed world. The early Iron Age is not merely the rubble of the Bronze Age, it is a field of new possibilities. Smaller kingdoms, mobile groups, maritime traders, highland villages, successor states, and revived empires all reshape the map. The collapse destroys one kind of order and allows others to emerge. This is why the Bronze Age collapse is not only a disaster story, it is also a story of historical transformation, of how the ending of one system becomes the opening condition for another. Still, the cost is immense. The loss of writing in some regions means lost names, lost laws, lost songs, lost memories that no archaeology can fully recover. Burned cities mean dead families, shattered communities, interrupted traditions, and fear carried across generations. To speak of adaptation should not soften the violence of the transition. Survival can be heroic, but it can also be hungry, diminished, and lonely. The people who build the Iron Age do so with the wreckage of the Bronze Age under their feet. And so, in the centuries after the palace's fall, the Eastern Mediterranean slowly becomes recognizable again, but not as it was. The old royal letters are no longer crossing the same routes. The old palace storerooms no longer pulse at the center of society. The old kings who called one another brothers have become ghosts in buried clay. In their place rise smaller communities, new kingdoms, new scripts, new forms of trade, new memories, and new anxieties. Civilization has not ended. It has changed its shape, and the shape is rougher, leaner, less confident, but alive. Civilizations do not remember their own endings clearly. They remember them through fragments, through ruins reused as foundations, through stories told beside older stones, through names that survive after their original meanings fade. The Bronze Age collapse leaves behind no single witness who can stand above the whole world and explain what happened. Egypt carves victory into temple walls. Ugarit leaves frightened tablets baked by fire. Greece loses the palace script that once counted its wealth. Hatti falls silent at the imperial centre, but echoes through successor kingdoms. Later, peoples inherit landscapes full of broken grandeur and build new identities among the remains. The collapse becomes not one memory, but many memories, each partial, each shaped by survival. This is why the event continues to feel mysterious. It is not because nothing is known. Much is known, and far more has been learned through archaeology, linguistics, climate science, and the patient reading of ancient texts. We know that palaces burned or were abandoned. We know that trade networks were disrupted. We know that the Hittite Empire vanished as a great imperial power. We know that Ugarit was destroyed. We know that Egypt faced major attacks and survived in weakened form. We know that Mycenaean palace administration ended and Linear B disappeared. We know that new peoples, new kingdoms, and new technologies emerged in the centuries that followed. But knowledge does not always create simplicity. Sometimes it reveals how complicated the truth must be. The Bronze Age collapse resists the clean comfort of one cause. It was not only invasion, though invasions and raids mattered. It was not only drought, though environmental stress may have cut deeply into the agricultural foundation of the age. It was not only earthquake, though some walls may have cracked before they burned. It was not only rebellion, though internal fracture likely weakened palace systems from within. It was not only trade failure, though the disruption of copper, tin, grain, and maritime routes struck at the heart of elite economies. No single explanation fully accounts for this. The collapse is frightening precisely because it appears to have been a convergence, a knot of pressures tightening around a world that had become brilliant, specialized, and dependent on connection. That makes the Bronze Age collapse feel strangely close, even across more than 3,000 years. The people of that age did not live like us, but they understood many things that still govern human society's diplomacy, supply chains, prestige, debt, migration, fear, propaganda, labor, scarcity, and the fragile authority of institutions. Their kings wrote to one another as brothers while competing for wealth and advantage. Their merchants moved goods across dangerous waters. Their administrators trusted lists, seals, and stored commodities. Their rulers believed that order could be maintained by ritual, force, and habit. Their ordinary people carried the real weight of that order in fields, workshops, ships, and walls. The warning is not that complexity is bad. Complexity allowed the late Bronze Age world to flourish. It created international diplomacy, magnificent craftsmanship, great architecture, written archives, specialized labor, and an exchange of ideas across languages and seas. It made possible a world larger than any one kingdom. The warning is that complexity requires resilience. It requires margins, trust, adaptability, and the ability to absorb shocks without passing every failure onward. When the margin disappears, connection can become a channel of collapse. The very roots that carry wealth can carry panic. The same dependence that produces prosperity can spread weakness. there is also a warning in the arrogance of permanence. To the people living inside the great palace systems, the world may have seemed troubled but enduring. Hattusa's walls were massive, Egypt's temples were ancient, Mycenaean's citadel looked immovable. Ugarit's scribes still wrote, ships still sailed, kings still used the old formulas, rituals still promised order, yet institutions can continue their gestures after their foundations have begun to fail. A palace may still count grain while the fields are no longer enough. A king may still demand loyalty while loyalty is becoming too costly. A city may still send messages while no one is able to answer. After the collapse, memory changes the fallen world into something else. In Greece, the lost palace age may leave distant echoes in heroic tradition, transformed by centuries of oral storytelling into tales of warriors, voyages, sieges, and doomed houses. In the Levant, new identities emerge from older Canaanite, Aegean, Highland, and coastal worlds, each remembering origins differently. In Anatolia and Syria, Neo-Hittite rulers carry forward symbols of a vanished empire without restoring the empire itself. Egypt remembers victory, but cannot restore the old balance of royal brothers. Everywhere, the past becomes material for new futures. The ruins are therefore not only evidence of death, they are evidence of inheritance. People after the collapse do not live in an empty world. They live among remain stones, roads, myths, tools, fields, habits, gods, words, and fears. Some knowledge is lost forever. Some survives without its original setting. Some is reborn in forms the Bronze Age kings would not have recognized. The Iron Age does not simply replace the Bronze Age like a new curtain over an old stage. It grows from the damaged roots of what came before. The deepest mystery, then, is not only why the Bronze Age world collapsed, it is how human beings continue after the systems that define their lives have failed. The answer is neither comforting nor hopeless. They continue unevenly, they suffer, move, adapt, forget, remember, and build again. They become poorer in some ways and freer in others. They lose the certainty of the old order and discover the harsh possibility of new ones. The night civilization forgot itself was not the end of civilization. It was the end of a particular dream of order, the dream of palaces that could count the world, kings who could bind distance with gifts, archives that could preserve control, and bronze networks that could keep power shining across the sea. When that dream broke, the world did not stop. It became harder to read, and in that difficulty, the Bronze Age collapse remains one of history's most powerful reminders that even the greatest systems are temporary arrangements between people, land, weather, resources, belief, and time. The fires have cooled now. The walls of Hattusa stand under open sky, no longer guarding an emperor's voice, at Ugarit. Tablets that once carried fear now rest as artifacts, their urgency separated from us by thousands of years, and yet still strangely alive. In Greece, the palaces that counted wheels, grain, oil, and bronze have become ruins beneath later memory. Along the Levantine coast, the sea continues to move as it always did, bright in the morning, dark at evening, indifferent to the ships it once carried and the cities it once threatened. Time softens catastrophe, but it does not erase it. A burned palace becomes an archaeological layer, a famine becomes a climate signal, a frightened message becomes a museum object, a vanished empire becomes a chapter title. Yet behind every name and every theory were people who did not know they were becoming evidence. They lived inside the present tense of their own fear. They waited for grain, for ships, for soldiers, for rain, for replies that did not come. They did not call their age the Late Bronze Age. They called it life. What remains is not a simple lesson, because history rarely gives simple lessons honestly. The Bronze Age collapse does not tell us that all civilizations are doomed in the same way. It does not say that complexity must fail, or that trade is weakness, or that disaster is always waiting just beyond the wall. It says something quieter and more difficult, that order is work. It must be maintained across fields, roads, harbours, households, courts, and memories. It depends on people who are often invisible until the system that uses them begins to break. And still, after the breaking, people remain. They plant again where they can. They carry children away from danger. They reshape old gods and old stories. They learn new metals, new roots, new loyalties. They build smaller homes in the shadow of greater ruins. They forget some names and preserve others without knowing why. In that survival there is grief, but also a stubborn human light. The Bronze Age kings feared enemies, famine, failed omens, angry gods, and the loss of their thrones. They could not have feared being forgotten in exactly the way they were, yet their world still reaches us, not as they intended, but through ash, clay, stone, and silence. The final image is not only fire in a palace, it is morning after the fire, when smoke thins over a broken city, and somewhere beyond the ruins, someone still walks toward water,